In chapter 4, we find Jonah angry. He's not just disappointed or confused, he's furious. Why? Because this is exactly what he was afraid of. This is why I fled to Tarshish, he says. Up until this point, we didn't know why Jonah fled. He hadn't told us that in chapter 1. But here he reveals that he ran because he knew God was gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in love. Jonah fled because he didn't want God to forgive Nineveh. What kind of prophet gets angry that God is gracious, compassionate, and abounds in love? These are the very qualities we cherish in God, aren't they? Jonah knows that God is a God who relents from sending calamity. But this makes him angry. Angry enough that he says he would rather die than live. Jonah's anger doesn't make much sense to us at first. Why would a prophet be angry at God for being merciful? To understand, we need to look at the context. Nineveh wasn't just any city. It was the capital of the Assyrian Empire, the cruelest, most brutal empire the world had ever known. The Assyrians were infamous for their acts of torture and destruction, completely devastating any nation they conquered. They forced Jews to intermarry with Assyrians, creating the hated group known as the Samaritans. To Jonah, the Assyrians weren't just enemies, they were the ultimate embodiment of evil. So Jonah wasn't just upset about God showing compassion, he was angry because these people deserved judgment. They were the enemies of God's people, and their cruelty was unmatched. For Jonah, the thought that God would forgive them instead of wiping them out was unbearable. But God responds to Jonah with a question. Have you any right to be angry? It's a simple question, but it cuts right to the heart of Jonah's complaint. Jonah wants justice. He wants these evil people to be punished, and it seems like God is being too lenient, too compassionate. God's justice, however, operates differently. Even when he issues a prophecy of destruction, God gives Nineveh 40 days to repent. 40 days is a significant number in the Bible. It represents a long, significant period of time. Israel wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. Jesus fasted in the wilderness for 40 days. And here, Nineveh is given 40 days to turn back to God. In other words, God is in no rush to bring judgment. He wants to give people time, as much time as they need to repent. Compare this to how we might react when we seek justice. In modern times, we don't typically give our enemies 40 days to repent. But God's justice isn't like that. His conditions are generous, even with people as brutal as the Ninevites. Jonah wanted quick, decisive judgment. He wanted to see God's wrath poured out on Nineveh, but God, in his mercy, withheld it. And this was deeply offensive to Jonah. We might sympathize with Jonah's frustration when we think about situations in our own lives. Imagine if the worst person you can think of in history just said they were sorry and God had forgiven them without any consequences. That idea would offend our sense of justice. We want wrongdoers to be punished, but God's love doesn't work like that. His love, as revealed in the story of Jonah, is bigger than our concept of justice. He offers grace, even to the most undeserving. This leads us to the heart of the story, forgiveness. Jonah's struggle with God's compassion reflects a tension we all feel when it comes to forgiving others, especially when they've wronged us deeply. Forgiveness can feel like swallowing something that's bitter and unjust, yet God calls us to forgive not out of obligation, but because it leads to freedom. Forgiving and letting go of righteous indignation and the desire for justice is never easy. But if you've been through that arduous process, you may have experienced the freedom it brings. I have. It was like all the emotional energy that had been used to seek justice was released. And surprisingly, I began to feel love, not just from God, but also for the person who had wronged me. Forgiveness doesn't feel good at first, and it doesn't come naturally, but it's not a feeling, it's an action. Once we take that step, it frees us from the weight of resentment and bitterness. The story of Jonah reminds us that God's compassion is bigger than we can imagine. He forgives even the most undeserving. And he calls us to do the same, to offer forgiveness, even when it's hard, even when it feels unjust, because in the end, forgiveness brings freedom for ourselves and for the world.